Thank you, Alex, and great to be here, and thank the hardy crowd who have stayed around. So this is going to be our conversation about what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen in 2020 as you begin to see not only the Russians, but perhaps other states and other actors, not necessarily state actors, begin to learn from 2016 and to begin to tailor their strategies to what they can do to influence the election, which might not necessarily be on the side of Donald Trump. In fact, one of the interesting questions I think we can debate is whether Donald Trump is at this point of little use to the Russians because he's the one person who can't get sanctions off and so forth. But we'll get to that. We have a fabulous panel for all of this. Rihanna Peppercorn is the Associate Director of Surveillance and Cybersecurity at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. Stanford campus is full of all kinds of interesting centers that have different pieces of these. But she has looked a lot at U.S. government policy on forced decryption, which you may recall came up at great length about 3 years ago, pitting Director Comey of the FBI against Tim Cook at Apple. But she's also looked at a lot of other issues, including deepfakes, which we'll take a look at, and so forth. Kathleen Jamieson is the professor of communication at the University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School, a great place, and she's written a lot of books, but her most recent, Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, is terrific for those of you who have not read it. Knowing that I was coming to this panel brought me to finishing the last chapters I had not finished, and it's great through and through.
Did you really read all those regressions in the end?
I have to say that I did go past a few regressions. Yeah. Okay. And my good friend Laura Rosenberger directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. They've done fabulous work in this area that we've relied on heavily in our own coverage. We also have sort of a running debate, some of which we will play out for you today, about how reporters should go deal with information that's leaked along the way. She was the foreign policy advisor for Hillary for America, where we had lots of interesting conversations as well during the campaign. And before that was at the National Security Council and at the State Department, and knows a huge amount about Asia-Pacific issues, which is where I got my start as a foreign correspondent, but we're going to have to do a different panel to take up those another day. So, Laura, let me start with you. Let's assume for a minute that Vladimir Putin has already gathered everybody around and said, there's one thing we can't do, which is play the same playbook that we played in 2016. So what is it that we should expect and look for in 2020?
Thanks. David's characterization of some of our interesting conversations was very diplomatic. So I enjoy David as a sparring partner, very, very sound intellectual sparring partner. So thanks. It's great to have this conversation with everybody. So I'm going to start actually with one of the points that you just raised in your introduction, which is this idea or the premise that Russian intervention in our democracy or in an election would be about picking one candidate or another. And I would reject the premise a little bit, because I would say that, number one, if you look at the intelligence community assessment from January 2017, the Mueller report, as well as the two expert reports that were done for the Senate Intelligence Committee, it's very clear that the Russian interference operations started before Hillary Clinton had declared her candidacy, started before Donald Trump had declared his candidacy. These operations were long in the making, long before who was going to be in the race was clear. Now you could say, it was a foregone assumption that Hillary was going to get in. They didn't like her, fine. But if you look at the documentation of what the Russians did in 2016, their tactics and their end goals actually evolved throughout the campaign. And it's only towards the end that trying to help Trump becomes the actual goal, and that's at least according to Mueller and the intelligence community. And I would argue that's also what the evidence from social media shows. Now, that's not to say it didn't also, I mean, part of their goal was to hurt Hillary and all of that, right? So there were definite effects there. But I think it's also important to understand that from the Russian strategic perspective, elections are not the end goal. Electing a candidate is not the end goal. Weakening American democracy is the end goal. And sometimes oftentimes elections prove a very useful moment in time and a significant opportunity to advance that goal. But they're not campaigns as in like a battle campaign that start and ends with an election, right? I would argue that the operations that the Russians started in 2014 have never stopped. They have had different phases of operations. They didn't stop after 2016. They didn't stop after the midterms, and they are ongoing. So it's not like we're not going to use the same playbook again. How do we restart things anew? It's continually how do we tweak this as we go along, and how are we going to achieve the greatest effect that is to the advantage of Vladimir Putin, which is basically discredit democracy, weaken America, sow a bunch of chaos, maybe polarize us, all these different things, weaken NATO, weaken EU, all these different goals that are involved in there. And again, sometimes choosing a candidate, helping a candidate, or hurting a candidate may be part of that equation. So that's kind of backdrop. So when it comes to how I see their tactics currently evolving as we look towards the 2020 mark, a couple of things. One, Chris Wray this morning, the director of the FBI, gave a set of remarks at the Council on Foreign Relations in DC, where he made very clear that he's extremely worried about 2020 and Russian intervention, that the FBI is seeing their tactics evolve. They are seeing others begin to adopt parts of this playbook. I would point to a couple of specific ways that I, in my work, have seen Russian tactics evolving, and they are, I think, of great concern because they have even deeper implications for our democracy than what we've even seen so far. So the first is, I think we will see much more continued use of social media, the sock puppet, fake persona accounts that we've seen in the past. I think we're going to see a little bit less of the botnet, the sort of computational propaganda activity, because that is one area where the social media platforms have gotten better. Largely speaking, Google and YouTube accepted. They have not gotten better. The others have gotten a bit better at detecting the automation. But the sock puppet fake persona accounts remain much harder to detect. And what we are actually seeing is an evolution of, rather than these accounts doing what they did in 2016, which was create fake activist groups themselves, create fake events sort of out of whole cloth, and then try to stand them up. Those are a little bit more easily detected by the platforms at this point. What we're actually seeing is much more recruitment of activists. So it's kind of like traditional espionage, but like hypercharged with the anonymity and sort of darkness of social media. So using fake persona accounts to recruit real activists to create new groups or propose certain kinds of events that are from a more radicalized perspective, again, both sides of the political spectrum, than what those activists may do on their own. And that has really significant implications from both a free speech and a free assembly perspective, because you have real activists that are potentially trying to do something they think legitimately, but with the potential discrediting of sort of the Russian hand. Quite worried about that kind of activity. The second thing I'm very worried about is, we've done a really good job about sounding the alarms about the vulnerability of our election systems, the actual election hardware. I have to tell you, of all the threats that I'm worried about, this is the thing I'm least worried about, in the sense of actually being able to change a significant enough number of votes to have an effect on the outcome of the election. But what you can do, and what I actually think may have been happening in 2016, is you can sow enough doubt about the integrity of the system and couple that with information operations saying, we hacked the system and you can't believe the outcome. And so you sow chaos and doubt in the outcome of the election, even if you haven't actually hacked anything, right? And those are the kinds of things that I'm quite worried about, that combined effect. The third thing I'm really worried about, and this is even more so the case with some of the other actors, particularly the Chinese Communist Party when we look at their tactics, is the actual recruitment, not just via social media, but of human influencers and assets. And one of the reasons I'm particularly worried about this in this moment is that the special counsel concluded in his investigation that certain kinds of in-kind assistance from a foreign power don't constitute a campaign finance violation. If you had asked any of my colleagues in 2016 if accepting any of that kind of stuff from a foreign power would have violated campaign finance law, not to mention like our morals and ethics, it would have been a no-brainer. Everybody assumed that those were campaign finance violations. And I am worried that both the Russians, but also other countries, and like I said, particularly the Chinese Communist Party that rely on these tactics very heavily, may see that as a significant opening to really flood the zone of very direct targeting of campaigns and their apparatus in a very direct way.
Great. Laura, before I go on, let me just press you on two things that you said. So I agree completely. The Russians got into this before they knew who the candidates for sure were going to be, except Hillary was a pretty good bet. They certainly got into it before Donald Trump came down the golden elevator a few blocks away, escalator. But the intelligence has showed that they went in with sort of three different phases, right?
Right.
So the first was to pick divisive issues. That's what that fabulous road trip was about of the Internet Research Agency people who came to the United States and traveled around, who I still think would make a really great movie one day around here, traveling with the IRA. Their second phase was a denigrate Hillary, had it in for her because of the things that she said in statements about the 2012 parliamentary election in Russia. And then the third phase was, wow, this guy Trump might actually win, and then stepped in. So do you believe that for the next election, they have a multi-phase plan underway? Or do you think it's just, let's divide and conquer here, avoid the things that Facebook's now good at finding, and just see how it plays out?
Well, what I would say is, so your phases are exactly right? The three phases you laid out from 2016. I would expect them to also have a phased approach here, just as they've had a phased approach, by the way, from 2016 to the midterms, right? There was a phased effort there. Since the midterms, we've seen another phased effort. I am very worried about potential chaos creation in the Democratic primary process, particularly attempting to seize on issues that notably divide the candidates on the Democratic side and trying to create further polarization amongst the 20, I think we're at now, candidates running for the Democratic nomination. So I think, if I were them, I would say phase one right now is how do I make the Democrats most at war with themselves? Because essentially, I think they're going to be thinking, again, how do we weaken as much as possible? And a divided Democratic Party is not going to be particularly good for the health of the country. And so I think that would probably be phase one. I would argue, though, that they're not going into this right now saying that they know what phase 2 and phase 3 are going to be, right? I think if, Tulsi Gabbard somehow, became a real candidate, Russia would have a very different set of interests in the general election in 2020. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. But I think it will depend a little bit on how some of that plays out. And I think that they will be prepared to shift their strategy when it comes to that. I think there's a couple things that are important to bear in mind with how the Russians operate, right? One is that some of this activity is highly directed and controlled from Putin and the presidential office, but a lot of this is also a variety of oligarchs and other officials around him doing what they believe is Putin's broad bidding, right? So they have sort of broad guidance, go out, do, create, blah, blah, blah. It's pretty disaggregated in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of spaghetti thrown at the wall to kind of see what sticks. And so some of the phasing, I think, is also like the stickiness and adapting along the way there.
And we learned a lot in Mueller about how much the oligarchs and
yes, indeed.
Talk.
Yes,
I didn't
did.
realize they had regular staff meetings. This went on. Kathleen, so in your book, you took us through the hacking phases, which Mueller also went through, but then you had really fascinating analysis of the trolling that took place that almost made you wonder along the way how they got this good at doing this. But the more you studied the trolls, how would you answer the question of what they are likely to do differently in 2020?
Now, let me step back from the trolls and just say they, so include the hacking in the troll analysis.
Yes.
I share the concern that you could delegitimize an election without actually touching something. What I would look for, because we know there is penetration now in a county in Florida, I would look for something that looks like this, going into a key battleground state and taking every 10th person whose name is Smith and change the middle initial or change one word, one number in the voting address. So that when everybody named Robinson, I would do the same thing. And I would do it I'd spread it out randomly so it wouldn't be every 10th, but it would average out that you'd have a 10th so that you wouldn't be able to see a pattern underlying it. I'd do a random generation of numbers to select my Robinsons, my Smiths. And as a result, when African-American voters come to the voting pool, they would disproportionately have a problem. But nobody would actually know what the problem was, and you could discourage voting on the margin. So I would worry about that sort of thing. I also worry about looking as if you're there and not actually doing anything, because I think that delegitimizes. But my worst nightmare isn't that, and it would put them directly into what I think everybody would call cyber war. I worry about taking down part of the electrical grid. And on election day, because our voting machines are tied to electrical structures, most of them don't work if they don't have electricity tied to them in some way. You could take down enough of, for example, we took down the East Coast because we had a real problem one summer, which many of us remember. You wouldn't be able to cast enough of the electoral college vote because you wouldn't have enough of the votes being able to be legitimately tallied in order to elect a president. What you do is you keep the incumbent. And we don't have a scenario under which we know how to manage that. There's no constitutional provision. There's nothing inside a legislative structure. And that would really create chaos and high levels of disruption. But you wouldn't want to do it unless you could keep your fingerprints off it, because it would constitute, I believe, a direct act of war, tampering directly with infrastructure. So I think you'd risk retaliation. But then the legitimacy of the person who's in office would be questioned. So maybe the person would or would not retaliate under those kinds of circumstances.
And that exact scenario was proposed and looked at in the Situation Room in 2016 as President Obama was considering what could happen on Election Day. It's one of the reasons that he elected to sort of, as we might now view it, underreact, right? I mean, he went off and warned Putin, but he didn't take any of the retaliatory steps that many of his aides were suggesting to them.
But I also...
For exactly the concern that they could play that grid game.
But my understanding is the warning was highly targeted.
Yes.
It was basically, you leave our election structure alone.
That's right.
And as a result, tacitly, the Obama administration may have been heard to have said, hey, the hacking's okay, and the release is okay, and the trolling is okay, but just don't you do anything we can monitor that says you attacked the electoral legitimacy of the...
And I'm not even sure they understood very much about the trolling at that time.
Yeah. But if I were the Russians, that's what I would have heard. Or at least I would worry that that's what the Russians heard. That is, you're licensed to do the other because we are really focusing on you better not do that. We're going to take that really, really seriously.
One of the concerns that President Obama had in 2016 was that even if the Russians were successful at just showing that they had gotten into the registration system, but as Laura first suggested, hadn't really done anything to it, that would, in the thinking that they had at the time, give Donald Trump, who they expected would lose, the opportunity to cast doubt about the legitimacy of Hillary Clinton's election. Do you think that had the 77,000 votes in 3 states gone differently, that you would have in fact seen Mr. Trump do just that?
We don't know, but I think it's a very interesting hypothetical, because if you look at the messaging of the trolls, what you see is setting up the rigged argument and reinforcing the rigged argument. And as a result, it looks as if the message structure was being set up to legitimize that claim. And of course, candidate Trump was making that same claim, famously not indicating in the last debate what he would do if he had a rigged election outcome that he lost.
And to that end, I think that my, again, unprovable hypothesis at this point is that a lot of the probing that we saw of the state systems in 2016 would have been sort of made public and revealed kind of covertly by the trolls at that point in time as evidence of, why the integrity of the election was in doubt.
But it wasn't the best hidden cyber operation I've ever seen.
No, I don't think it was intended to be.
It wasn't
hidden,
intended
right?
to
I
be
mean, the October 7th statement actually noted that there had been attempts on several state election systems, even though it didn't attribute it to a particular state actor.
Well, and that raises what I think is my third scenario to answer your question, is you could actually sow discord by engaging in some sort of what looks like tampering and then planting a footprint that looks like it was the other political party. And you want to really create chaos, you can't blame the Russians. You now say, oh, that was the Republicans or that was the Democrats. See, here's the suggestive evidence. And I think when it's easy for us to find something, I make the assumption we were supposed to find it. I think there are ways to plant things to look as if here's where you're supposed to be looking, that given the way things leak through a press structure could legitimize the notion that it was probably the other party. And at that point, you've now got a really strange electoral dynamic, inside messaging, before you've ever been casting ballots.
We'll get to the leaks in the press in just a moment. Rihanna, scary as Kathleen's scenario is of turning the power off, you spent a lot of time on the fascinating issue of deepfakes, which, if taken to their extreme and if done artfully, could include candidates appearing to say things that they never said, or putting them into positions, compromising or otherwise, that they were never really in. Just ground set us for a minute about where the technology for deepfakes is compared to the 2020 timetable.
It's a great question. I tend to agree with some comments that Claire made on the previous panel, which is that I'm not sure that the technology is really going to be there to do convincing, neither computer systems nor humans can tell something real from a fake video. Between now and 2020, whether that's still true 5 years from now, I don't know if that'll be the case. But right now, in terms of what is commercially available basically for free on Reddit and other internet sites, I think that we are not going to be there yet for having persuasive, convincing deepfakes that cannot be detected, even as this cat and mouse game of improving detection systems and improving the generation systems continues between now and over the next 18 months. Really the place that I think I worry about deepfakes is kind of relating into some of what we've been discussing so far, is not so much about the actual potential for deepfake videos themselves to wreak havoc or to sow distrust or elevate dissension, along pre-existing fault lines, but what has been called by a couple of scholars of deepfakes on the legal side, the so-called liar's dividend, which is the capability of presenting something that is true, that is real, as being a fake, and basically playing to the public's awareness that deepfakes exist to undermine sort of public or voters' belief in their own ability to tell something that is true from something that is false. And that's something we heard a little bit about on the previous panel also from our Brazilian colleague, talking about the attempts to sort of rewrite history on the basis of, who are you going to trust, your own lying memory, or, what we want to do to rewrite the history books. So I think there's a lot of room there to basically foment mistrust of what we see as evidence where that may be real and it may be legitimate, it may be actual footage of a speech or a particular candidate doing something or saying something in the past that is real, but that is discounted because of the very potential that you could cast in people's minds that it might be fake.
How does that differ from what's been done in political campaigns for generations? I mean, people have self-selected little bits and pieces from campaign appearances, Senate hearings, so forth, packaged them in an ad, and very artfully eliminated the caveats and so forth. And I think a lot of political professionals will tell you that isn't called deep fakes, that's called campaigning.
Right, and this is something that Kathleen, I know you've worked on this for many decades, on how do you package this up and present it to the public persuasively. And I would say that it actually, I take that fact that we have an antecedent for these practices as being something kind of reassuring. You know, I hate to be an optimist in any way, shape, or form. We haven't had a lot of that in this room. Journalists aren't cynics, are you? But the fact that we've been able to deal with these pressures before, and that, you know, the republic has not fallen, I think gives me some hope. I think a lot of the outcry over deepfakes tends to be sort of a knee-jerk reaction that ignores the fact that we have a very recent example that probably a lot of people in this room may have worked on. It's not that recent anymore, but when Photoshop came out in 1990, there was a very sort of swift move and recognition on the behalf of journalists that this was something that absolutely could not be mishandled and that needed to be, you know, put into context. There was an instant where I think it was Time magazine darkened O.J. Simpson's skin on a magazine cover using, you know, retouching tools such as Photoshop, and it was the response was very swift to recognize we cannot afford to do this because it will undermine the credibility of journalists if we are found to be messing with reality and with truth in this way. And so the fact that there was both a fairly swift, I don't know how swift, but a consensus that was reached within the journalistic community around how to respond to the availability of these tools, and the fact that we have had the context of those tools being available, previous generations of tampering technology, or, you know, wag the dog style fake videos being generated, you know, cherry pick clips, et cetera, and that we've been able to be resilient to those threats in the past gives me hope that even in an era where it's a lot faster and more networked for people to be able to spread both true and false information to each other, that we may be able to survive this one too.
Great. Well, since you've raised the question of how reporters should begin to go deal with this, and I want to get in a moment to how we're targeted, Laura, let me ask you a version of a question you and I have debated out over cups of coffee and things stronger over the years. Okay. So supposing for a moment I was an investigative reporter, okay? I realize this takes a leap of imagination for many in the room, okay? And supposing that somewhere in the middle of the campaign, I got a hold of, over email, a group of documents from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee from back when Joe Biden was its chairman. And they revealed internal discussions within the Foreign Relations Committee, maybe during some classified hearings and so forth, in which he expresses opinions about things we ought to do in various places around the world. And I don't really know what the origin of this thing is, but I do go around to staffers of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, show it to them and say, these look real. And they come back and say, as far as we can tell, these match up with real dates and real meetings, and we think from our memory these transcripts are pretty close to real. What am I supposed to do with that?
So you painted a highly prescribed scenario there, David. Yes, which is not the scenario we faced in 2016. I would just
No, it's not. It's not. I'm looking at 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would say a couple of things.
You'll have total freedom to go back.
Okay, so I can relitigate the past as much as I want. Good. Okay. I want that license. So I would say a couple of things. One is, you know, I am not a journalist, right? I'm a national security person. That's the angle I come at this with. But I would say that when you don't know the sort of source of the information, as with any journalist, right? I mean, in any reporting, any source has a motivation to talk to a reporter. That's always the case, right? It can be benign, it can be helpful, it can be adversarial, they could have a grudge. There's tons and tons of reasons. And evaluating that context of your source's motivations and potentially including that in your reporting on the information is really important in any reporting and evaluation of a source. And so I think it's important to acknowledge, so in that scenario, you basically said it's impossible to determine both the source and the motivation. So that's point one. And I think if that's the case, if there's a decision to report on either the receipt of those documents or the content of those documents, then that information needs to be disclosed to readers, that you as the reporter cannot assess the source and its motivations, right? One. Two, I do think that there's a distinction to be made between a story about a leak or a hack, and I would, by the way, distinguish between hack and release efforts and leaked materials. And I think it's extremely important to understand the difference between those two things. There's a difference between leaks and hacked, stolen, and then subsequently what I would argue is weaponized material. And so reporting on that fact versus reporting on the contents of those documents. And so I think from a reporting perspective, one question is, do I need to report on the actual contents to convey, if I can't verify the source, and I'll come back to the contents in a second, but do I need to report on how much of the content do I need to report to really convey the essence of this story, and what is the real story here to be told? And then three is the veracity of the information itself, and can you authenticate it? Can you verify it? And again, different papers have different standards on how many different sources you need to confirm a particular piece of information. In this instance, you said you went around and talked to a bunch of the staffers, that the transcripts largely hung together. What I would note that we've seen in a lot of releases in the past, not relitigating yet, is that sometimes we see selective excerpts of things that are released without full context, which can distort the impression of what was happening in a particular conversation, an email exchange, et cetera. You may potentially have things that have been manipulated or altered, and we know certainly that Russia has done that in the past. And so I think it is also important to be able to either, number one, evaluate, do you believe that you have verified this to a standard that is one that you would print under other circumstances, and two, making clear to your readers, again, how much you have or have not been able to confirm. And then I guess the last point is that I think in reporting on this kind of information, it's incredibly important to include information on the provenance of the information and the, again, the motivations of the source, if you know it or not, and then the broader context around it. And so if a decision is ultimately made to report on contents of hack and release information, which, again, not clear from your scenario if that's what it is or if it's some other kind of leak, and I think there is a lot of reasons that those are distinct things, then it's really important to include
So
that context.
in that scenario, you don't know if it's hacked and released, or you just know you've got it.
Right.
It's a little bit like our early days with WikiLeaks in 2010, when I first got the material.
Is it, though?
With a team.
No, no. Here we go.
Hold on a sec. Let me finish the sentence, and then you can rip it apart.
Okay.
In the early days of that, it took us a little bit, not long, a few days, to figure out that this would come from Chelsea Manning, but because.
Oh, you mean those WikiLeaks?
Those WikiLeaks.
You mean that WikiLeaks stuff?
2010.
Got it.
2010
Okay.
stuff,
okay.
right?
Right.
And then, of course, we went to the State Department.
I remember.
To do step two. You were there at the time.
I did. I remember saving a whole bunch of Chinese human rights activists that reporters wanted to print the names of.
Right. So we went there and we said, we've deleted this stuff out, but we have to see if these cables are accurate and are they actually reflect the cables in your system. And of course, the State Department, understandably, didn't want to play in that because they didn't want to acknowledge whether or not these were legitimate efforts.
Also, they were classified information.
And they were
Would have been
classified.
confirming classified information, which is
That's
illegal.
right.
So,
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Now, ultimately, they did confirm for us.
Certain parts.
On 150 cables that we looked at.
Yeah.
Kathleen, as you look at how the press handled 2016, and particularly you looked at what the Mueller report said, which included some very specific Russian approaches to individual reporters, what lessons should we pull out of that?
That was the one piece of the Mueller report that I found the most interesting. That is, when the information was coming through DC leaks and Guccifer 2, before there had been official confirmation that it was Russian. So in fairness to the reporters, the Mueller report documents 2 contacts, one in July, one in September.
CrowdStrike had confirmed in June of 2016 that the DNC hack was Russia.
Right, but that's not official.
I'm just saying,
governmental
there was enough reason for reporters to have some.
Granted, but I'm going to be sympathetic to the reporters for the moment, and say that
Thank you.
that there are 2 documented exchanges in Mueller to unnamed reporters, in which they were given what I would call an advance. Take a look, and that is really of concern to me, not because of what they did in that time, because I don't know what they did. I don't know who they are. I'd like to know that. But because when we got the official government confirmation, now you had multiple sources that had said, and the government comes in on October 7th and says, yes, it was the Russians. I wonder why those reporters didn't come forward and explain that they had had this contact and make that part of the press narrative. I also wonder, given the rules that I agree with, that reporters in general do follow in other cases, how it is that we somehow missed the fact that there was Russian sourcing in most of the news reports. They lose track of that very quickly, and they don't indicate the self-interest that Julian Assange has in this as a tie to WikiLeaks. So Assange doesn't like Hillary Clinton for all sorts of reasons. If you're interested in motives of things, at least you'd want to let the public know that there's something going on there and put some context in. And after October 7th, I think it's inexcusable that every time WikiLeaks is cited, there is not. This is Russian hacked content as confirmed by the intelligence agencies. And so I think we had a whole series of journalistic lapses, not sourcing, not saying they hadn't independently verified. And I think the rule was a default rule. I think it was the burden of proof shifted to the Clinton campaign to establish that something was inaccurate, instead of on the reporter to confirm by some other source that it was accurate. And when the Clinton campaign wasn't able to make that case or decided not to, I think the press felt vindicated and didn't feel the need, which I think it still has under its journalistic norms, to continue to say that it had not been independently verified. But then on additional lapses, if you go back and look at a lot of these stories and use the test of newsworthiness, so my first answer to any question you ask about this is it newsworthy? Is there something important enough that we need to share it? And I assume every good reporter asks that question. Well, then go back and look at those stories that are generated through October and ask how many actually passed the test of newsworthiness. So was there such a strong notion that because it was hidden and been disclosed, it must hence be newsworthy? And is it that Hillary Clinton didn't release them when Bernie Sanders asked for them, and as a result the hacked speech set had to be interesting even if they weren't, and as a result there's some kind of a scandal frame locked around this? Alternatively, and there's an additional problem here, you have really good reporters, people I genuinely respect, who took things out of context of the hacked content, I think because the narrative about that had been so strongly set by the Republicans and by conservative right-wing media outlets. And so when one tracks back and sees reputable reporters in broadcast and also in print saying that Hillary Clinton said that she stood for open trade and open borders, period, when she did not. There's a whole rest of that sentence. There is no period there. It's sometime in the future, and then she talks about energy transfer. This is just bad reporting. And since these are good reporters, my only explanation is the narrative must have been so strong, based on Bernie Sanders calling for it, Hillary Clinton not releasing, that the assumption was that when they saw it digested that way in the very quick first reporting, when they scrambled to get all that stuff out on October 7th and spotted that thing, they never went back and looked at it again.
Can I add a point to that, which is actually on that open borders point? The truncated phrase was the WikiLeaks tweet.
Yeah, it's not only the WikiLeaks tweet, it's also moving through the right-wing blogosphere with extraordinary speed.
So you had to go into and actually read the underlying text, but the narrative that was driven, so this is the other point, which we can come back to in a moment, but is the social media aspect of this, which I think is important to recognize how that drove both the narrative in 2016, but also the way reporters, frankly, were used and manipulated by Russian trolls. So Columbia Journalism Review study of 33 media outlets in 2016 found that 32 of 33 had printed content from what we now know were troll accounts operated by the Internet Research Agency as being legitimate Americans. So it would be African-American activist from New York says that Hillary Clinton is bad on criminal justice issues and therefore she's bad for African-Americans, and so that's why she's urging people to support Jill Stein. Well, that was an IRA troll account, a very prolific one, who got a whole lot of attention in a whole bunch of press, actual traditional press, and 32 of 33 outlets that CJR studied did the same thing. So lots of elements to.
And so you would argue out of that even if Twitter had not yet identified them, of course Twitter had not identified them at that point, they would have, that they should have been kept out from quoting those just on the basis of our inability to prove that it was an authentic account.
Yeah, I think from what we know on social media now, I think that the sort of standard for reporters, and I know that some news outlets have moved to this. I actually know a lot of reporters will reach out to me now. I'll tweet something and they'll say, hey, saw your tweet, really want to use that. Can you send that to me in an email confirming it? Reporters I even know, right? But their outlets have basically gone to a standard of you can't just use a tweet to quote. I think basically moving to a position of assuming that somebody, we now know on social media that we can't necessarily verify that these accounts are who they portend to be. And so reporters should take it upon themselves to verify if they want to quote that person, reach out and say, hey, can we meet for coffee or hop on the phone, but there's ways to work around that too. That should be the default mode.
Rihanna, what you're hearing described aren't deep fakes, they're really shallow fakes, right? I mean, they're something that is not all that sophisticated.
Right, yeah.
And if a bunch of, I dare you call them cynical reporters, fall for them that quickly, well, first, tell us what you think about that, how reporters should have handled that, and then secondly, tell me how much worse you think that's going to end up looking in a year.
So, I have to admit that one of my pet peeves is when I read a news article and half of it is just putting embedded tweets in there and saying somebody said this on Twitter, somebody said that on Twitter, whether they are a public figure or, a reputable expert or not, it doesn't strike me as being as deeply sourced or as verified as I would prefer to see. And when it comes to this kind of, fairly simple way of pulling the wool over people's eyes, I think of this with a framework, to go back to the deepfakes point as well, of what I would call like the Punnett square of effectiveness for Russian and other disinformation campaigns, which is inexpensive and ineffective, expensive and ineffective, expensive and effective, and inexpensive and effective. And it's that final category that all of those fall into, and that right now, like really good deepfakes probably fall into either expensive and effective, but too expensive to bother with when you can just continue having troll accounts, or the downstream risk of something that costs a lot but that can be trivially unmasked. To take the example of, I think it was Macron's campaign planted fake databases in the lead up to the French election that were meant to be hacked as honeypots, that once those got leaked, they would be able to point to that to basically undermine the hackers and try and sort of shore up their own democracy that way. So when I look at concerns over whether it's deepfakes or anything else, I'm just sort of saying, how you were talking about adapting the 2016 playbook. I think it's easy for all of the very cheap and low-cost strategies to be rerun in exactly the same way, and that admittedly, I concur with you that the platforms have done a better job, but my colleague who's now at Stanford, Alex Stamos, used to be the chief information security officer at Facebook, and one of the things he said is, we just did not conceive of disinformation and troll accounts like this as a vector for abuse. They thought of abuse as being spam, as being, those fake Ray-Ban type, sunglass ads that would pervade your Facebook account at some point. Of being harassing content. They were not conceiving of this kind of false digital information campaigns as being an avenue for abuse. And I think that we need for journalists to be taking that same sort of approach, to try and be a little cannier about verifying sources and about looking to the depth and length and history of these accounts, and trying to. There's a lot of your traditional methods that I think probably translate very well into the digital era. This is the thing about, the tried and true approaches that we've had for years, which is the fact that something is digital doesn't make it magic wizardry. And when it comes to something like invoking deep fakes and saying, wait, isn't that just the same as tampering with a photo, or isn't that the same, or a tape or anything else? It's not that different. So you don't need to throw your usual historical playbook out the window. I think there's some adaptations that might need to be made, but the temptation is there, I think, to just treat this as being somehow above everybody's ability to understand that it's like magic when it's not.
Just to reinforce your point about Alex and what he said about Facebook, I think I quoted him in The Perfect Weapon as saying that it's not that they had their radar off. It wasn't sort of like Pearl Harbor. It's that they hadn't even built the radar for this, which I think was a worthwhile observation on his part. Laura, you know more journalists than anybody I know in D.C., and I've been doing journalism here for a while, which probably means you go to a lot cooler parties than I go to. But as you look at the news organizations that are spread around Washington and political reporters, and I know you've been talking to a good number of them lately, how much thought have they put into what 2020 could look like and not repeating mistakes of the past?
Look, I think that there are, so the political reporting beat, as you know, is a somewhat unique one, and there's obviously people who have been long on that scene. But also when it comes to campaigns, you have a lot of young folks who are bright and shiny and just out of college and just out of journalism school and heading out as embeds on the campaign trail. They're
Because they're the only ones willing to put up with those buses and the box lunches.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
And look, they've got tough jobs, right? And they are under a lot of pressure, and they're relatively new, or they're brand new. And so I think it's important to remember, like when we talk about like journalists and who's talking about this, that there's a range of folks here. There's pros like you who've been at this for a long time, who understand the various dimensions to these questions. There's reporters who've been covering these, the political beats for a long time, like Maggie. Then there's others, right, who are just brand new on the scene. So I would say that there is a considered conversation amongst a small segment of folks, and then most folks are just waking up to this problem, and just beginning to have serious conversations about what this means for 2020 and themselves. And I worry that we're just having this conversation and 2020 is already underway. And, many folks, including, by the way, Alex, who's been quite eloquent but also pointed on the need for not only social media to understand its role and do better, but also the traditional media. And so I don't think we have done nearly enough of that in the years since 2016. I'm glad that these conversations are happening now, but I think that it's urgent. I think that newsrooms and editors and publishers really have to, I think that we need to have some standards that are set across news organizations. I mean, I'd actually love to see some broad societal standards set amongst different journalist organizations on some of these issues, because I recognize that they're challenging. I would just say two additional things on that. One is that I think it's important to recognize that we have seen in a number of different countries. You want to talk about tactics that we'll see? One of the things that the Russians are trying to do, and this is very distinct from, for instance, what the Chinese are trying to do, the Russians are trying to undermine the idea of truth, right? Maria Ressa talked about this earlier today, right? Just the narratives just being thrown out. You're not actually trying to drive one particular thing. You're basically trying to create the perception that there is no truth. It's the other reason that on the deepfakes front, that like if you can't trust information, it's so problematic. That has very direct implications for the press, right? Because your job, journalist's job is to present the truth and the news to the best that you can report it, right? To inform the democratic debate in that space. And if there is a war in which, frankly, it's being waged against what you're actually trying to do, I think that has some broad philosophical questions, and I'm not the right one to answer this, on frankly what the role of the media is, and can the press be in some ways neutral in a sense when the war is coming at the press, at the truth, right? Democracy dies in darkness, the banner on the Washington Post, right, since the 2016 election, has as much, I realize that was probably put there with a very domestic political intent, but it has as much of a resonance, I think, if we think about regimes like Moscow and Beijing and what they're trying to do. And so I would just posit that as a question for all of you who are doing all this really important work to consider, because I think that that's going to get even more challenging as information warfare becomes even more and more of the game that is being played on the geopolitical scene. And the one very specific thing I would just say on that is that I actually think one of the things that does worry me tactically as we head into 2020 is I would not be at all surprised if there are hacks on media outlets themselves.
Well, yeah.
At all surprised. as a way of discrediting journalists and a way of discrediting reporters. And when we already have a lot of use of, a lot of...
Or revealing sources.
Or revealing sources,
Yeah.
or revealing internal debates about what's reportable and does this meet the standard. And, all of the very natural debates that you would have in a newsroom, coming out into the public in a way that is leaked out selectively, possibly, with an intent of sowing doubt about the reporting. And so, number one, I would urge anybody in this room to make sure you're using encrypted apps. If you're using Slack, please don't. There was a good story out today on Motherboard on how Slack has admitted publicly or that they are being targeted by nation-state adversaries. So don't use it. But be extremely mindful of your cybersecurity two-factor please or Google Advanced Protection or whatever the case may be. I'm going to go on my cybersecurity rant right now. But I would say that journalists are targets. Absolutely. And I would not, and we've already seen this in a couple of different instances from other countries, other nation states, and and within other democracies. And I would not be at all surprised if that's part of the playbook that we see now. Because again, my view is that this isn't just about elections, this is about discrediting democratic institutions. And obviously, the free press is a huge part of our democracy. It is a really important institution in our democracy. And if Russia can discredit the free press, that's also a win for them.
Just to reinforce something Flora said here, just for the other journalists who were in the room or wondering about the internal practice, I was one of the early experiments for Google Advanced Protection because the Chinese and others were all over my personal email. And of course, they hacked the New York Times after we ran a series of stories done by one of my colleagues about how the Prime Minister's family in China had
I remember very well. It was a wonderful article.
And they were looking for sourcing on that. I found the Google Advanced Protection, which actually requires a physical key into, or a Bluetooth one into your phone, or physical one into your laptop, has greatly reduced the amounts of warnings I'm getting about state hacking into it. We use encrypted apps to talk within our bureaus and so forth. And there are, you can tell which ones you want to go use, because there are some that are used by friends of ours in the intelligence community, and there are some that friends in the intelligence community won't touch, presumably because they know they've cracked them. So,
can I just add really quickly, to go to the cybersecurity point, it's not only about protecting yourself and protecting your sources through the use of multi-factor authentication and encrypted apps and so forth. One of the things that I do worry about, this relates back to what we were talking about with regard to voter databases and voter rolls, is attacks on archives. You have your own archives that may go back decades, and if there can just be some selective tampering with that, some exfiltration of data from that can be modified and then re-uploaded, if that fact can then be released, that there's just been some small tweaks made to something, whether that is a news article from years ago or whether that is a video, maybe a eyewitness citizen recorded cell phone video that gets uploaded, that can be shown to have been tampered with or been shown to be fake, then that's something that I think could also severely undermine just the trustworthiness of the reporting coming out, or even going back and trying to reconstruct history. We were talking on the previous panel about trying to go back and change history through trying to rebrand it now. So I think in addition to worrying about the cybersecurity of your own practices, you need to be thinking about how do we secure all the servers that have all of our stuff on it going back years, and looking at that as a potential avenue for attack in the next couple of years.
Did you have anything, Kathleen? It looked to me like you were getting ready to say something.
No, I just want to say, journalists actually got hurt by their conversations that were leaked with the Clinton campaign. I mean, journalists became the object of special, appeals, saying that they're biased. Look, see, this is the back channel. This is how they talk in back channels. And when you read it, stepping way back, what you realize, it's the natural pattern of ingratiation when you're trying to get someone to do something. If you look at the interviews that followed, those were good journalism. But yeah, it's not that this hasn't already been part of the leak structure of this last election, and some very reputable journalists were potentially hurt by it, at least in those circles in which that was trafficked within the like-minded centers.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, we've got about a little less than 15 minutes, and I wanted to make sure that we reserve some time for questions from all of you. There are a lot of lights here, but if you raise your hand, and we'd be... oh, wow, we can actually... There really are people out there. There you go. Who wants to be the first victim? This is not usually known to be a quiet crowd. Yeah, please.
Hi. Is this on? Oh, it is on.
Yes.
Whoa,
Yes.
sorry. Melissa Wasser, Coalition Director, News Media for Open Government. So I'm interested in reading the Slack article. I also work at Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and I know, similar to other organizations here, we're always worried about security. Are there any other best practices? I know we're, moving from no authentication to two-factor authentication seems like a big hurdle, and then now moving to encryption keys that use Bluetooth and other options like that. Are there any best practices or best communication channels we should be using just generally in journalism?
Rihanna, you spend a lot of time looking at encryption issues and so forth. Please go ahead.
I mean, I use Signal personally. I prefer that. They don't keep metadata, which is another thing. It's not just about whether, malicious actors can get access to that information in an era where we're starting to see Espionage Act prosecutions, or at least threatened, rumblings about that for journalists and their sources. I think it's also incumbent upon people to
Want to
use.
explain a little bit better how Signal
Sure,
operates with the metadata versus
Yeah. So
Facebook chats or something?
in terms of encryption only protects the contents of your messages, doesn't protect the metadata about them, which is what phone number was talking to what other phone number and for how long and on what dates and at what times. That tends to be clear text that can be obtained by a court order, right? So one of the things that sets Signal apart is that they do not keep that. They know the time that an account was created, and they know the last time that it was seen, but they do not keep metadata around of saying that David and Laura were chatting together and how many messages got exchanged. And that is really valuable in the context of being able to, if a government wants to be able to obtain a court order to see who was talking to who and try and track down who your sources were, the fact that Signal cannot comply with that is really meaningful, I think.
And they keep their servers in Switzerland, do I?
I want to say it's Switzerland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which means that they would have to be served through the highly efficient Swiss legal system, which was likely to go slow them down. One of the reasons we use Signal is not merely that it encrypts, but because of this very point, it not only makes it harder for the Russians and others, it makes it harder for the U.S. Justice Department if they're on leak investigations. Yeah. Either the two of you on this issue?
No, I mean, I would just reinforce, number one, I also use Signal, and it is the only encrypted app I use. I've offloaded all the other ones. They don't even exist on my phones. My own practice is I assume everything I put in an email will be read by one or other foreign governments, or possibly my own, but most likely foreign governments. Given the work I've done, similar to David, I've got a whole bunch of foreign governments on my back for a long time. So I just assume that if it goes in an email, it's something that I would be okay with seeing publicly, and that's just kind of how I operate. That means that there's a lot of things I don't do on email. It means I do that like old-fashioned thing of picking up the phone a lot. It means a lot of things get moved over to encrypted apps. And yeah, as I said, the multi-factor stuff, I know it's an inconvenience, but the convenience factor here should not be what drives these decision-making processes. And frankly, once you have the advanced protection stuff, like once you're logged on, you only actually need the hard keys on advanced protection when you're logging into a new device, and so it's actually quite. It's really not a significant hurdle at all, at least as I've found it to be, and I think the protection is seriously worth it. There's other things out there. There's Proton Mail, which is also an encrypted email system, which also has its servers in Switzerland, which a lot of folks use, particularly human rights activists and others who are really concerned from that perspective. is another one. There's other platforms out there. There's one called Wicker, which is an integrated encrypted email and chat platform. So there's a number of different options out there, but I think that it's just really, some of this is just a sort of cultural mindset shift on security forward, right? And making the security considerations sort of first order principle in deciding how to handle information and then going from there.
And that goes for, your sources as well as your own communications. I think a lot of the time you have to be able to meet your sources where they are. Like none of us, I don't use end-to-end encrypted email services because it's a pain in the butt to configure any of that stuff. So, encouraging your sources to work with you over Signal is an easier thing to do rather than trying to walk somebody, through some complicated security apparatus. When we had the Snowden leaks, it was sort of the other way around. It was the source trying to teach the journalists how to secure themselves. I think we've come beyond that point. But, we live in a world now where Reality Winner is in prison in part because the Intercept screwed up the security of trying to put the document stash out there that she had leaked. And I'm sure there's a range of opinions on this panel about, what to think about Reality Winner, but it's easy to compromise your sources just through sloppy security practices around the information in the documents that they're sharing with you, which may be watermarked or otherwise traceable back to the source. I'm not the best person to talk to about that. If everybody could just replicate Runa Sandvik and make several clones of her, the information security specialist for the New York Times, I think a lot of newsrooms would be better off. But
Runa is the one who helps us sort through these, and it's interesting that the Times has not just one person dedicated to the question of how we do our own internal communications for these purposes. And it's Runa I'll turn to on the Slack case, among others. Other questions out there? Yeah. There's one coming right down to you. Oh, take her first, then we'll get you next.
My name is Amanda Barrett. I'm the Nerve Center Director for the Associated Press. And I was thinking back to 2016 and seeing the role that race played in the election. What are you foreseeing as we head into the race for 2020? Okay.
Who wants to handle that?
I'm happy to take it first. So most of the data, particularly on the social media side and the info ops side, race was the biggest weapon that was used by the Russians across any issue set. And that includes targeting of the African American community directly, as well as using race and racially divisive rhetoric on the right to sort of froth up polarization and sort of emotional heated rhetoric there. And what I would say is we've seen no abatement of that whatsoever. And, look, on some of this is a really good example, but on many of the issues that the Russians have managed to use and manipulate, we've given them a very fertile target surface. Our inability to address racism in our country and to deal with criminal justice issues that have a very significant impact on particular communities is making us weak as a country. I mean, I believe, frankly, I've said very clearly, racism is a national security issue at this point. It's being exploited by our adversaries. If we don't recognize that, we're just leaving ourselves vulnerable. But the reality is that it's actually getting harder to address some of these issues because the polarization is being frothed up and we're being further divided on these issues. So I would absolutely expect this to continue. And the example I gave earlier, one of my concerns about the activist communities, being essentially infiltrated is, and I've talked about this, essentially is the hijacking of activist movements as a way of delegitimizing real activists. And we've seen a number of those instances in the run-up to the midterms, in particular, targeting Black Lives Matter activists. And I'm quite worried about what the impact that those kinds of efforts will have on legitimate activism, which is, of course, enormously essential to a functioning democracy. So I think that's one. I think Kathleen's scenario as well on the voter rolls and changing some names, and in particular trying to suppress the black vote in key areas is another potential way it could be used. But I would expect, as long as we have this festering wound of racism, it's going to be a major target for Russia and others who seek to undermine us.
We have time for one more. It's right here.
A point was made that Russians and other actors want to sow discord in our elections. So we have 20 candidates on the Dem side and one so far on the other side.
Two. Bill Weld.
Two. Oh, yes, sorry. I stand corrected. How prepared are the campaigns to prevent, to dodge any kinds of manipulations that will inevitably happen?
Let everybody at this. There have been a lot of interesting programs, including one at Belfer that has done, the Belfer Center at Harvard, that has done a good job of bringing campaigns in, but they did that back in earlier in the spring and some in the fall, before several of the campaigns that are together here even knew they would be together. So it's a great question. Rihanna, Kathleen?
I was really disappointed in 2018 when the RCCC didn't make the same statement as the DCCC. The RCCC said it didn't intend to use hacked content. The DCCC said it wouldn't. I think we ought to ask of every candidate, and I believe it's being asked, are you, going to agree that you're not going to use hacked content? And then we ought to make an issue about it and explain why it's problematic for that kind of use to be made. So, I mean, at the minimum, before we ask whether they've secured their campaigns, and I think that's a whole separate domain, I think we ought to get them on the record on everything that is publicly, that we get publicly available, including, will you pledge not to engage in dark ads on the web?
Kathleen, let me just put you on one thing. I could imagine two different scenarios. One comes up from the hypothetical I gave before, where a campaign may not know that whether the material was hacked or whether it was, released by some unhappy insider or whether it fell off a truck. So that's number one. And number two is, once the material is out in the ether, in the ether out there, it must be really hard for a campaign to pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I grant all of that. But I think we ought to have, at least we ought to set up a debate about whether we ought to have as a principle whether things that have been illegally gotten should be dropped into the body politic in the absence of all sorts of authentication to make sure it's real.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be used by somebody in some place, but I think these are people who want to lead the country. So I think they have some moral obligation to behave in a fashion that's better than the mob.
A classic example here was the Steele dossier, which we were given and we did not publish.
Yeah.
Others did publish, but eventually you couldn't sort of avoid the topic matter because it was so widely out there, and we now know from Mueller that we had good reason to hold back on publishing a good deal of it. Ariana, anything on this?
I just want to sort of contextualize, since the talks have fallen apart between the Democrat and the Republican parties on trying to strike some agreement to not use hacked or leaked materials, I think they're in a position where they see, withholding from using those materials as being, having fewer matches than the other side has to ignite the same pool of oil. And this is something that I think resonates with journalists as well, is that if one side is willing to use tools that you're not willing to, then are you just putting yourself at a disadvantage? And so I would try and push back on that assumption to try and say, well, we need to not allow somebody else to rush into that gap, and we need to make use of something that we might otherwise choose not to, as a matter of principle, if I dare use that word in closing. But if the politicians can't agree on not using hacked materials, hopefully at least journalists will be able to contextualize those decision makings when they're trying to decide what to do with those themselves.
Well, I want to thank all three of our panelists, Rihanna, Kathleen, and Laura. I want to thank all of you at the Society of Professional Journalists for organizing this for World Press Freedom Day. And I want to thank particularly our audience here who stuck with us and asked such great questions. So thank you all for participating.